We've touched on throughout our chats about other legislation working alongside this Joint Several Liability umbrella legislation, which in effect amounts to anti-avoidance. So we're talking about corporate legislation, or we've talked about tax promotion, etc. There is other legislation that's coming in which will have an effect on how an agency looks at an umbrella. And the thing that comes to mind is the Employment Rights Bill. Now, although it's not fully formed and there's been a timetable that's put certain things back, what's your take on that? I know you're not an employment lawyer, but it still does have an effect, and it is part of the advice that you give to agencies and clients. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, it's not the first time that different bits of legislation potentially clash. So what I mean by that is if you look at a situation where an end client engages an agency worker and that agency worker is employed by the agency, it gives a big tick in the box for the Employment Rights Bill, because they're hopefully getting all of the employment rights as a result of that contract at the minute. But the end client is then on the hook for any pay-as-you-earn and NIC failures that the agency might participate in under the Joint and Several Liability legislation. Those two things butt up. So the obvious answer to avoid any issues with the Joint and Several Liability for the end client is to say to the agency, don't have them as employees, have them as workers, or engage those workers through an umbrella as employees, because then that shifts the Joint and Several Liability down the chain to the agency. So you've got to look at all of this in the round. You've got to, if you're an end client or an agency, you've got to understand what your supply chain is doing from an Employment Rights Bill perspective, from a contractual perspective, from an employment status issue, so that you can properly assess what risks need to be managed and by whom. Because if you don't do that, you'll get caught out and you'll be surprised when you do.